From the evidence found at the scene of a double homicide, police suspected there might have been two perpetrators, until they noticed a clue. A small shard of glass on the bottom of one of the victim's shoes, which brought the whole crime into focus. In December 1996, a mail carrier in Toledo, Ohio, noticed mail piling up outside the home of Gertrude Thompson and Edward Kowalczyk. Neighbors said they hadn't seen the elderly couple for the last few days. 69-year-old Gertrude, Trudy to her friends, and 72-year-old Edward had been living together for the past several years. No one could see inside the house since the windows were covered with plastic, cardboard, and aluminum foil in an effort to preserve heat. Not knowing what else to do, neighbors called police.
When I first went in, I observed a lot of what appeared to be personal effects of the residents there, like boxes packed up. It appeared to me someone might have been preparing to move out of the house.
But in the disarray, detectives found Trudy Thompson and Ed Kowalczyk dead on the living room floor. They had been dead for several days, and it was no ordinary murder.
It's just so violent. You could see the bludgeon, cut marks, stabs. One of the worst crime scenes I ever seen as a police officer.
An autopsy revealed that Trudy and Ed had died of blunt force injuries to the head. Other evidence suggested that the assailant had wanted information from the victims.
Just slight wounds, puncture wounds, where this person probably was saying, where's the money, or something like that, and just torture to make a person talk.
There was a great deal of chaos there. In fact, it appeared as though this was almost a frenzy type of murder. The perpetrator or perpetrators grabbed anything that was available to them in the house and used it as instruments.
We always assumed there was at least two people that were involved. And that's just because it was a double homicide with two bodies right next to each other. And they weren't killed with firearms, they were killed slowly with hand weapons.
Detectives noticed that there had been no forced entry into the house.
Well, it tells me that possibly the person that committed this crime probably knew the victims and probably was let in.
Ed and Trudy not only lived together, they were business partners. They owned several properties that they rented to lower-income residents and college students. When a tenant moved out, the couple usually kept items left behind, never throwing them away. This made it hard to know what, if anything, was missing.
We were finding money hidden in books and in wallets that were still in their package, and in places where they would hide things that no one would think to look.
Family members told police that a necklace Trudy Thompson wore around her neck every day was missing. It was a gold elephant pendant, a gift her father had given her years earlier as a child in Austria. The pendant was supposed to bring good luck.
The police knew pretty quickly how important that was. If you could track a piece of stolen property back through a chain of owners, you can learn eventually, hopefully, who had taken it from Gertrude Thompson.
So police put a photograph of the pendant on the front page of the local newspaper, the Toledo Blade. No one responded, and none of the second-hand jewelry dealers in town had seen it either. In gathering information about the couple, Ed's daughter, Denise Kowalczyk, said that Trudy was a tough businesswoman.
I felt that Trudy could be bossy and domineering. I think she was probably argumentative with her tenants and my father.
Family members suspected that the motive wasn't robbery, but it was some sort of business disagreement.
A tenant that was really, really mad at them, mostly her. It's not totally unreal that this would happen because of the people they rented to.
That information, along with a message on the couple's telephone answering machine, would identify just that, one of the couple's tenants, someone police called the perfect suspect. When landlords Trudy Thompson and Ed Kowalczyk were found murdered in their home, police and forensic scientists sorted through the physical evidence at the crime scene for possible clues. Forensic pathologist Dr. Diane Barnett first wanted to identify the murder weapon.
She had long linear impressions, tool marks on the skull. She had a very characteristic beating pattern that had been left on the outer table of the calvarium. And she also had suggestions of a corner of something, like a divot type of impression.
Dr. Barnett was able to match those wounds to a rectangular base lamp at the murder scene. Forensic anthropologist Julie Saul matched another head wound to a brass lamp found near the bodies.
Looking at the lamp base with the beading near the edge and the tool marks on the bone, I could tell them that this was consistent with having made that mark, and it was very likely that it could have made that mark.
None of these items, however, contained fingerprints. The coroner determined Trudy and Ed had fought off their attacker or attackers since they had defensive cut wounds on their hands that could have been made by a knife. And a tiny clue on the bottom of Ed Kowalczyk's shoes answered an important question. It was a tiny piece of glass embedded in the bottom of his galoshes. That glass came from a broken light bulb, leading investigators to believe that Ed entered the room sometime after the attack started. Most likely, he walked in from outside, since his coat was found at the front door. In a search for suspects, the first clue came from the couple's telephone answering machine.
A lot of the tape was complaints from various tenants, because Gertrude Thompson and Edward Kowalczyk were landlords. Were people calling in, leaving them messages.
But only one tenant had called numerous times. His name was Ethan Walls. When questioned, Walls told police that he stopped by Ed and Trudy's home to make his rent payment, noticed the overflowing mailbox, knocked on the door, and when there was no answer, he said he left his rent check there and went home.
I put it in their mailbox. There was a lot of mail in the box. I didn't think anything of it. 2-3 more days went by. I had left a note for them to contact me. No one ever got in touch with me.
Walls then admitted he went back to Ed and Trudy's house, retrieved his rent money, and spent it. These two admissions placed Walls at the scene twice around the time the murders took place.
And all of a sudden, Ethan's telling him this very bizarre story about dropping off a check and then coming back and picking it up.
In addition, an informant called police to say she had seen Ethan Walls at the home of a well-known drug dealer around the time of the murders. She also said Walls' shirt was spattered with blood.
Based on the blood spatter on the ceilings, on the walls, the condition of the victims' bodies, you knew the guy that did this had to have gotten covered in blood. You knew that.
Walls vehemently denied the informant's story.
This is a lie. From where did it come from? Who put you up to saying what you said? Which is, it's not true. Totally fabricated.
In examining the blood spatter at the crime scene, detectives noticed a significant clue. The blood spatter was in 2 different shapes and told 2 different stories. In one area, the spots were elongated and radiated from where the beatings took place.
blood that comes from an angle is longer and more oval, usually with a little tail at the end of it. The longer and more oval the spatter is, the greater the angle that it came from.
In another area, away from the bodies, there were several blood spots that were perfect circles, including 2 on the inside of a broken ceramic vase and 1 on a piece of paper in the desk drawer.
The blood that was on these items was dripped straight down as if from right above. So from that we were able to determine that this blood most likely did not come from these 2 victims and was therefore most likely the suspect's blood.
The blood was consistent with someone standing still but bleeding, and the blood dripping down on the items below. Police confiscated every knife they could find in Ethan Wall's home, testing them for human blood to see if any were used in the murders. None of them tested positive for human blood. They also compared all of Wall's shoes to a bloody foot impression found at the crime scene. None matched. But since the perpetrator left blood at the crime scene, investigators had a definitive way to tell if the blood belonged to Wall's.
You know, DNA, I mean, 1 drop of blood looks the same. Your blood looks just identical to mine. It's those little scientists who can differentiate between 1 drop and another.
The results surprised everyone, especially Ethan Wall's.
They arrested me like 5 months after the DNA. That's the part that I still right now today don't understand.
Toledo police had a suspect in the murder of 2 elderly landlords. One of their tenants, Ethan Wall's, who swore he was innocent. Wall's had been to the couple's house around the time of the murders, and an informant claimed she saw Wall's at a drug party with blood on his shirt around the same time. Wall's gave police a blood sample so they could compare it to blood found at the murder scene. Investigators believe the killer cut himself while swinging a crystal lamp to beat the victims.
We surmised that that was probably how he held the lamp as he hit them with the heavy metal base of the lamp. And when that crystal broke in his hand, that's probably how he cut himself.
Forensic scientists analyzed the DNA of all the blood at the murder scene. On the crystal lamp, there was a mixture of blood from 3 people, the 2 victims and the killers. DNA analyst Angela Lenine compared Ethan Wall's blood to the mixture. If it matched, 2 numbered markers or bands would match those found in the mixture.
Ethan Wall's pattern was an 18 and a 28. The mixture also had an 18, but it did not have a 28. So he can automatically be excluded as contributing to the mixture of that specimen.
But prosecutors always suspected that there may have been more than 1 perpetrator, and based on the informant's testimony, that Wall's was one of the 2. Wall's was arrested and charged with the murder of Trudy Thompson and Ed Kowalczyk.
The day I was arrested, last thing I said to them, please don't stop looking for the killer. Because while y'all focusing on me, somebody is getting away with it. That was the very last thing I said as they put them cuffs on me. Don't stop looking.
Ethan Wall's knew he could face the death penalty if convicted. He was consumed with anger and frustration.
It's like if you're down in a well and you hollering at the top of your voice. Can't nobody hear you, though. You know what I mean? I'm innocent, man. Can't nobody hear you, though.
As prosecutors were preparing to try Ethan Wall's, their star witness, the informant, made a startling confession to prosecutor Tim Braun. She now said she had lied about Ethan Wall's.
We never were given a good explanation as to what her reasons were. Other than she's saying, I lied about the man, and this isn't right, and I'm not going to testify against him, we can't necessarily control all the pressures that come onto a witness. And she flipped. And that's the only way to describe it. She flipped completely 180 degrees the other way.
Braun had no choice but to dismiss the charges against Ethan Walls.
You know, the day you dismiss a death penalty case when you're a prosecutor, it's a bad, bad day. Because everything you've been working on for a long period of time is just blown up in your face.
I was confident that I would go home. That never, ever wavered in my mind. I knew I was going home.
For the victims' families, it reopened the fear.
That there was maybe someone out there that might be really sick and evil, that they could do something to someone else.
And for police, it was back to square one.
It was very frustrating because we had 2 elderly people murdered brutally in our community. We felt we had some good evidence, blood, and the missing pendant. If we could nail that down, we definitely would have a person that we could totally concentrate on.
For the next 2 years, police made no further progress.
All the detectives talk about the 72-hour rule. If a case isn't solved within 3 days, the chances of it getting solved go way, way down. And that's true. And this was not solved within 3 days. But they kept going.
For 2 years after the murders of Trudy Thompson and Ed Kowalczyk, investigators pursued various leads in the case with no success. But in July of 1998, their luck changed. The daughter of pawn shop owner Annette Cheverini decided to help her mother clean up some of the old newspapers and magazines that had collected over the years.
My mother is more than eccentric. She believes in not throwing anything away type of an attitude. She's a collector.
But Annette wanted something to read that afternoon to pass the time.
She reaches in the middle of the stack of newspapers and pulls a newspaper out. Sure enough, she opens it up and she starts to read this article that was there from the Toledo Police Department about a double homicide.
It was the 2-year-old newspaper article about the murder of Trudy Thompson and Ed Kowalczyk. When she looked at the victims' photographs, she noticed something familiar: the gold elephant pendant around Trudy Thompson's neck.
She calls me on the phone and starts screaming about, where's this elephant pendant? Where's it? I said, Mom, it's in the safe.
Mrs. Cheverini had been unable to sell the pendant. It looked identical to the one Trudy Thompson was wearing in the newspaper photograph.
That's 1 in a million, I would say, for her to keep a newspaper like that.
Fortunately, Mrs. Cheverini kept all her old pawn tickets. The one for the pendant was dated December 3rd, 1996, around the time of the couple's murder, and it identified Gordy Candy as the seller. Candy said he was only a messenger, that it was James Jordan who had asked him to pawn the necklace for him. Jordan had been working as a handyman for Trudy Thompson at the time of her murder. A background check indicated that Jordan was arrested just a few weeks after the murders for another robbery and was currently serving a 45-year prison sentence in Texas. When questioned, Jordan denied he killed the elderly couple. Scientists swabbed the inside of his cheek for a sample of his DNA, which was then compared to the blood drops at the crime scene.
We concluded that James Jordan was the person that left blood at the crime scene.
James Jordan was charged with killing Gertrude Thompson and Edward Kowalczyk. Prosecutors believe the motive was robbery, to steal money from the rent payments to use for drugs. They think Jordan first tortured and killed Trudy, cutting his hand with a broken lamp and leaving blood drops in the living room. When Ed walked in later from outside, Jordan killed him too. As he was looking for money, blood from his hand dripped into the desk drawer. Before leaving, Jordan took Trudy's elephant pendant, then asked a friend to pawn it for him. The pendant fetched all of $20. That $20 transaction led to Jordan's capture.
He had to cash in that pendant. And but for that reckless act, we never would have linked him back.
In court, Jordan represented himself and tried to explain why his blood was found in Trudy's desk.
He explained the drops of blood inside her desk as being that's where she used to keep her Band-Aids. And so sometime when he was moving furniture or doing something, he must have shed a drop of blood while he was looking for a Band-Aid.
But Jordan couldn't explain his blood drops inside the broken vase, and he said he had Trudy's elephant pendant because she gave it to him as payment for his handyman services. But the jury did not believe his story.
We find the defendant guilty of aggravated murder.
James Jordan was convicted of 2 counts of aggravated murder and was sentenced to death. The case was solved thanks to the pawn shop owner who never threw anything away, and the forensic scientist's ability to recreate the crime based on the physical evidence.
The police work combined with luck and scientific evidence, a little bit of both, a little bit of everything. It all goes together.
An anonymous telephone call told police where they could find the body of a missing 9-year-old girl. The recording of that call had too much static and background noise for voice identification until forensic scientists worked their magic, which led investigators to a factory, a supermarket, and straight to the front door of a suspect. On the Friday before Easter in 1996, 9-year-old Jessica Knott spent the day playing, reading, and drawing.
The kids were home from school. I spent the day packing up clothes and getting ready for a trip that we had planned to make to my husband's parents' house to spend the Easter weekend with them.
Eventually, Jessica wanted to go outside to play and wait for her father to come home.
She said, I'd like to go downstairs and wait for Dad, because my husband was out shopping for Easter goodies. I said, fine, don't go anywhere else.
A couple of hours later, Kevin Knott walked in the front door, but without Jessica.
And it was starting to get dark, and he said, where's Jessica? I said, didn't you see her? She said she was right out front. He said, no.
Kevin and Peggy Knott searched everywhere. One neighbor said she saw Jessica sitting outside reading a few hours earlier, but hadn't seen her since. When police were notified of Jessica's disappearance, they instituted a parameter search of the area. But their first real lead was an anonymous telephone call saying that Jessica could be found not far from her home on Montgomery Road.
I have a message, Jessica from Los Altos. She's been missing.
The call originated from a payphone at a gas station on Montgomery Road.
I'm having a very hard time hearing you. What's there? Jess?
No one was there when police arrived. Crime scene investigator Deanna Tominski was called to the area.
While I was en route to the mobile gas station, they called me and informed me they had found a body of a juvenile female.
The body was in a dark, isolated area near a water system pump house, a quarter-mile from where the telephone call was made.
She was partially covered with a dark plastic garbage bag, and there were a couple of magazines, a mirror around her.
It was Jessica Knott.
I think it was Detective Rodriguez. I was sitting on the sofa in my living room, and he came in, and I just knew. He said, "I found your daughter." And I knew that she was gone at that point. So that was the worst night of my life.
It's like a nightmare for any parent. You know, I still have a hard time accepting it.
Deanna Tominski searched the area for possible forensic evidence. Jessica's clothing was intact except for one missing shoe.
It appeared that she'd been placed there, that she was not killed there, because there were items underneath her as well as on top of her, and there was a drag mark in the sand that corresponded with her left shoulder.
There was a tire impression nearby, which police photographed, then cast with plaster for future evaluation. The body was carefully removed for an autopsy, along with the plastic garbage bag in which the body was found.
The first thing you try to do is you try to eliminate people who know her. How could she have gotten away from there without raising a ruckus? You have to wonder, how in the world did it even happen that no one could see it? So the first thing to do, obviously, is to look at family.
When questioned by police, neither Jessica's mother, Peggy, nor her husband, Kevin, were able to provide an alibi for the time of Jessica's disappearance. Kevin said he was shopping. Peggy said she was inside cleaning her house, but neither could provide any independent corroboration. In Kevin Knott's vehicle, police found a roll of garbage bags which were confiscated for forensic analysis. And there was something else suspicious. An analysis of the anonymous call to police revealed the tone of the caller's voice as sympathetic, suggesting that the caller knew Jessica personally. If investigators could identify the caller, they most likely had their killer. The autopsy of 9-year-old Jessica Knott revealed bruising on her neck and the inside of her mouth, indicating someone had cupped a hand over her mouth and suffocated her.
We couldn't be sure whether it was strangulation or whether it was suffocation because of a hand over the mouth. Probably a combination of the two, actually.
And the contents of her stomach revealed she had eaten a fast food hamburger shortly before she was killed.
How can you treat a human life like a piece of trash? I mean, literally, he put her in a garbage bag and dumped her under a tree, I think it was. They found her. I mean, that really makes me angry, extremely angry.
Scott Ryland analyzed the bag covering Jessica. He found no fingerprints on it, and also determined that the bag was different from the type found in Jessica's father's truck. This eliminated Kevin Knott as a possible suspect.
They asked to interview me right off the bat, which I understood, and it was pretty hard, but it had to be done.
The trace evidence found on Jessica's body, hairs, fibers, and other materials were sent to forensic scientist Max Hauck. he immediately identified important information about the killer. The foreign hair found on Jessica's body was Caucasian. And there were two different types of fibers. Both were matte finished, very thick and rough, not the type used in clothing.
There's a certain look to carpet fibers, and there's a certain look to automotive fibers, and if you look at enough of them, you can eventually get a hunch, if you will, that it may be, in fact, from an automobile, either the carpeting or maybe the floor mats.
The fibers were from two different carpets, suggesting that Jessica had been in two different locations. And there was another telling piece of trace evidence.
And then there was the overwhelming number of animal hairs. The animal hairs were distinctive as to what type of animal they were from, a dog. Dogs have what's called a spade-shaped root. It also kind of looks like a small Christmas tree, sort of folded up and triangular in shape.
Houck then compared that dog hair to reference samples from the FBI laboratory.
I knew it wasn't going to be a Malamute or, some Alaskan Husky. So I went to short-haired dogs, black labs, Shar-Peis, Boston Terriers, dogs like that that have very short, sleek coats, and then started comparing the characteristics. All of the other dogs dropped out except for Shar-Pei.
All of this evidence told investigators that the killer was Caucasian and that he took Jessica in his automobile to a fast food restaurant. Later, Jessica was in another location where she came into contact with a Shar-Pei dog. Police then turned their attention to the anonymous telephone call.
The 911 tape, obviously a key piece of evidence. Everyone was convinced the person on that tape was the murderer, and we wanted to be able to identify that voice.
The call had been made from a public telephone at a gas station.
I'm sorry, sir.
And had quite a bit of background noise and static.
What's there?
Police sent the tape to NASA, asking scientists there to use the same audio techniques they employ to clean up audio transmissions from space. After that was complete, the tape was sent to Dr. Harry Holeen, a renowned forensic audio analyst who literally wrote the book on forensic audio analysis. Dr. Holeen felt certain he could identify the voice on the telephone call. All he needed was a suspect's voice for comparison. The tone of the caller's voice sounded to investigators as sympathetic, as if he knew Jessica personally. On a hunch, police played the tape for Jessica's mother, and her reaction was immediate.
My first reaction was, this voice is very familiar to me, and I think I had to listen to it a few times before I realized this, it was like a bell ringing in my head. That's it, it's the guy with the dog.
The guy with the dog was a neighbor. She just couldn't recall his name. In their grief, friends and neighbors left lilies and toy rabbits where Jessica Knott's body was found on Easter weekend. Meanwhile, Jessica's mother had provided police with a suspect. She said the man who called police pointing them to Jessica's body sounded like a neighbor who walked his dog in the area. Police identified the man as 35-year-old James Edward Crow, who had no prior arrests. Crow lived with his wife, who was a nurse. He was unemployed and spent quite a bit of time walking his dog, Pumpkin.
He stayed home and watched the house and the dog, and walked the dog around and talked to all the kids. Now, that's not the worst thing in the world in some situations, but it certainly makes you wonder.
Something about him made me feel uncomfortable, but it's not a thought that I dwelled on.
Pumpkin was a Shar-Pei, similar to the breed whose hair was found on Jessica's body. A neighbor had seen Crow talking to Jessica outside the apartment building shortly before she disappeared. Crow admitted talking to her, but denied having anything to do with her disappearance. investigators searched Crow's vehicle. Amid the debris, they found a bag for a kid's meal from a nearby fast food restaurant. Remnants of a fast food hamburger had been found in Jessica's stomach. And Crow had brand new tires on his truck. Police discovered that Crow had replaced them just after Jessica's death. And in Crow's apartment, police found a box of black garbage bags, the same size and brand as the bag found with Jessica's body. Could they link the garbage bag from the crime scene to the garbage bags in Crow's apartment?
There are a huge number of garbage bags produced, typically on the order of 9.5 million bags in 1 month's time. So the question is, how many of those 9 million bags could be like this bag found on Jessica Knott's body?
To find out, investigators turned to Noel Roberts. As a quality control expert for the manufacturer, he knows garbage bags. Roberts said that the numbers stamped on the box indicated where the bag had been made. The bags in Crow's apartment had been made in Virginia. The goal of mass production is to quickly make an identical product over and over again. But Roberts knew that not every trash bag was truly identical. He invited Scott Ryland and prosecutor Chris White to the plant to understand how the manufacturing process worked. How plastic is recycled, melted, blown into a huge tube that cools as it ascends, and then made into rolls of thin sheets that are cut and folded into bags. Manufacturers use a variety of materials to make the bags, including scraps.
You're taking a random amount of white plastic bags, of yellow ties that have iron in them. The white plastic bags are very rich in titanium dioxide. So what you have, depending on this random variation in the scrap that's being used, a change in the concentration of the iron and the titanium, and in fact, it turns out from day to day.
To reveal the elements in the plastic, Scott Ryland focused a high-intensity X-ray beam on samples of the bags found in Crow's apartment. A fluorescent spectrometer reveals the elements in the plastic and their relative concentrations. The bag found with Jessica was virtually identical to the bags in Crow's apartment, indicating they had been from the same batch of plastic. Another characteristic was visible to the naked eye. When the plastic is made, bits of debris will get lodged in the machinery. This produces imperfections in the plastic called dye lines. Because the obstructions causing the lines come and go, the pattern on the bags is unique to a specific window of time.
And it almost gives you a fingerprint type identification, where you can take one bag and really match it up with the next bag in a carton and be pretty sure that it is a consecutive bag and from the same batch.
The dye lines in the bags found in Crow's apartment lined up with the dye lines in the bag from the crime scene, meaning all the bags were manufactured within hours of each other. Often, the bags are not folded evenly. The amount of overlap in the edges, called an offset, varies over time and with each machine used. The offset in Crow's bags and the bag with Jessica's body also matched.
I think most people would say, wow.
We're not dealing with 32 to 34 potential boxes, but it narrows it down to half that number. It's probably realistically 16 to 17 boxes of bags out there as potential sources of the bag found in Jessica's body.
Meaning that there was a 1 in 17 chance that the garbage bag came from Crow's apartment. James Edward Crow was arrested and charged with the murder of 9-year-old Jessica Knott. Forensic scientists were able to determine that the carpet fibers found on Jessica's body were consistent with the carpet fibers in James Crow's apartment and in his automobile. and the dog hair on Jessica's body was consistent with Crow's dog. The garbage bags in Crow's home had the same striations and offset overlaps as the bag with Jessica's body. This meant that Crow owned one of the 17 boxes of bags that the bag from the crime scene could have come from. Finally, Dr. Harry Holeen compared a sample of Crow's voice to the voice on the anonymous telephone call.
And he came to a conclusion somewhere in the 90% range that this was in fact the same voice.
Based on the forensic evidence, prosecutors believe that Crow used his dog to start a conversation with Jessica while she waited outside for her father.
You like dogs? You want to try taking them for a walk? I guess. Yeah, it'd be really fun.
From there, he coaxed her into his car with a promise of a fast food hamburger. Afterwards, the forensic evidence suggests Crow took her back to his apartment, where she picked up the apartment carpet fibers and the hairs from his dog. For reasons unknown, Crow apparently suffocated Jessica in his apartment. He then hid the body in a garbage bag and placed it in the back of his car without creating suspicion. After dumping the body in the deserted location, he placed a call to police, probably out of guilt, which Dr. Holeen matched with his audio expertise. James Crow maintained his innocence, and his defense attorneys challenged the forensic evidence. In a separate hearing to determine the admissibility of this forensic evidence in the upcoming trial, prosecutors had to prove that the scientific analysis of the garbage bags met general scientific standards.
In the end, the judge said, I find it admissible. Not only do I find it admissible, I think it's some of the best forensic testimony that I've ever seen. And the jury is going to be very, very interested in this testimony. Well, you don't get those kind of compliments from judges every day.
Faced with the overwhelming forensic evidence, James Crow decided to plead no contest to second-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 40 years in prison with no chance for parole. In so doing, Crow avoided a possible death sentence.
All I can say is the man upstairs is waiting for him. Might possibly the man downstairs, too.
The Knott family was spared the ordeal of a trial, but in the courtroom, they showed Crow how much he hurt them when Kevin read a poem he had written.
Damn you to swift justice, to meet your maker, to face your God and feel his wrath. The sooner, the better. Damn you.
The Knotts never before realized the complexity of forensic evidence and the full measure of its power.
With all the DNA testing that goes on and just all the scientific technology that's available today, I think just helps everybody get closer to the truth of crimes.
It wasn't available, like, say, 20, 30 years ago. And it pretty much cut to the core of what happened.
The forensic capabilities of our local Department of Law Enforcement lab and the FBI lab are what made this case possible, in the sense of made it possible for us to prosecute it successfully. If we had not had the capabilities of those labs, I think James Crow would still be on the street.
In 1991, this tranquil pond in rural Connecticut was the scene of a horrific crime. 2 young boys were beaten, thrown into the water, and left for dead. Investigators had little evidence until they examined the pond itself and found thousands of clues invisible to the naked eye in a simple drop of water. Waterford, a small Connecticut town where the water table is so high, homes are built around numerous small ponds and lakes. In 1991, 2 boys we'll call Stephen and Bobby decided to spend their afternoon fishing at their favorite spot, Stenger's Pond.
Oh, that was pretty good. I told you.
Sometime later, they were approached by 3 older boys they didn't know. Without warning, one pulled a knife. The other 2 threw Stephen and Bobby to the ground. Stephen tried to fight back, but was hit on the head with a baseball bat, almost knocking him unconscious. Both boys had their hands and feet bound with duct tape and their mouths covered. Once out in the pond, Stephen was hit once again and held underwater so that he would drown. Bobby was next. Fortunately, he saw the bat coming and ducked, then pretended to be unconscious. After throwing Stephen and Bobby's fishing rods in the water, they took the boys' bicycles and fled. Bobby was able to remove the duct tape from his hands, mouth, and feet. He swam to Stephen to try and save him. By the time he got there, Stephen was unconscious. Bobby managed to get him to shore, then carried him a quarter mile to the nearest home. Deborah Chamberlain heard a frantic knocking at her door.
One had a serious head wound and was not very coherent, and the other was just almost hysterical. And so I knew that something awful had happened to the 2 boys, and that would be something that we would sort out over the next couple of minutes. But I think the duct tape was really almost my first impression, because I thought, oh my God, someone taped their wrists together.
Stephen was rushed to the emergency room of Lawrence and Memorial Hospital. Dr. John Urbanetti was Stephen's doctor.
Despite the number of people that I've seen with this kind of circumstance, he came as close as I've ever seen anyone come to not surviving.
As Stephen lay in intensive care, doctors questioned whether he would live or die. And Waterford police had questions of their own. Who had tried to murder Stephen and Bobby? And why? Waterford Police Detective Donald McCarthy was assigned to investigate the assault and attempted murder of the 2 young boys at Stenger's Pond. 13-year-old Stephen was fighting for his life, the victim not only of an attempted drowning, but of massive head wounds.
One of the doctors had told one of my detectives at the time that it was the closest he had ever seen anybody come to drowning and not being dead.
He was very lucky. The older child was unconscious. Had he not had his little friend with him, he probably would have drowned, I think.
Stephen's friend Bobby had escaped serious injury.
I think the remarkable thing is he had the presence of mind to immediately go to his friend and pull his friend from the water.
There's no doubt in our minds, if he did not remove that duct tape, the older male would have died if he did not remove him from that body of water.
When he came to the door, the little guy, amazingly, was quite a bit smaller than his friend. He was just literally supporting him completely.
Police went to Stenger's Pond to collect evidence, but they ran into a major obstacle. The crime scene was a body of water.
The fishing poles, the tackle box, the suspects had tried to sanitize the crime scene by throwing those items in the water so that the police would not recover them, making it difficult that the fact that they were submerged in water, we would normally not have fingerprints available to us.
The bat used as the weapon was found floating in a nearby sewer grate, but there were no fingerprints. And any other possible evidence, such as hairs and fibers, had apparently been washed into the water. Police talked to residents of the neighborhood closest to Stenger's Pond to see if they had seen anything unusual. Susan Picardi came forward to say that earlier on the day of the attack, a young teenager she had never seen before came to her door asking for help.
Yeah, I was walking down the street when I began to feel a little lightheaded and hungry. May I come in and get something to eat?
He said he wasn't feeling well. He was a diabetic and was in need of something, whether it was sugar or orange juice or a piece of chocolate or something. I immediately felt bad for him and invited him in.
Come in and have a seat, and I'll get you some fruit juice.
Thanks.
Mrs. Picardi gave the young man a glass of orange juice. A few minutes later, he said he was feeling better, thanked her, and left.
Because I can call a doctor.
No, I'm fine. Thanks.
Later, as Mrs. Picardi was about to take a shower, she saw something unusual in her bathroom mirror.
And I caught the image of what was going on in my backyard from upstairs. And I saw two other youngsters in the corner of my yard, teenagers, 16-ish, around there. A redheaded boy and another Afro-American young man.
And they were later joined by the young man who just left Mrs. Picardi's home.
She gave me orange juice. She treated me so nice.
The boys had a bright green baseball bat and what looked like rolls of duct tape.
I automatically panicked and knew whatever they had planned was not going to happen at my house. So I yelled out the window to them, I think you better leave. It's obvious that you're planning something or you're up to trouble, and I'm calling the police. So if you know what's good for you, then you better get going.
Susan Picardi was able to provide a detailed description of the boy who'd come to her door.
Mrs. Picardi told us two things that stood out. One, he was wearing eyeglasses and described those eyeglasses to us. The other was he had an unusual shaped scar, a U-shaped raised scar on his forearm.
Since the perpetrators were apparently on foot, police checked the neighborhoods nearest to Stenger's Pond.
We put officers in that neighborhood and started doing neighborhood canvasses, and that based on the description of the three suspects. As a result, we were able to identify the suspect immediately.
This suspect, 17-year-old Brian Davis, had the upraised scar described by Susan Picardi. Neighborhood informants identified the two friends Davis spent the most time with. One was 17-year-old Christopher Green. The other was an African-American juvenile whom we'll call Jason. All three suspects fit the descriptions provided by Susan Picardi, but denied they were involved in the assault. In Christopher Green's house, police found a knife like the one Bobby had told them about. In Green's basement, they found a pair of wet, muddy sneakers.
We inquired of the suspect, why are these things wet? And he was trying to tell us that it was as a result of walking through mud puddles and things like that. As soon as he said that, we started working on a theory that, how do we attack this? He's coming up with a defense. This is how my clothes got wet. I was playing in mud puddles and things like this.
Was the mud on Green's sneakers from Stenger's Pond? And if so, how could scientists prove it? For the answers, police turned to a new type of forensic science, one that had never before been used in a criminal case anywhere in the world. "13-year-old Stephen, the oldest of the two boys who were assaulted and left for dead in Stenger's Pond, was in intensive care for a week. His condition gradually improved. He was extremely fortunate. Doctors found no evidence of permanent injury.
Fortunately, he'd had an episode that was short enough so that he suffered no permanent injury to his brain. But during the time of recovery, he needed a fair amount of intensive care support.
Police had 3 suspects in custody: Brian Davis, Christopher Green, and a juvenile we'll call Jason. All denied any involvement in the attacks. Brian Davis and Jason had no prior brushes with the law, but Christopher Green had a long history of petty offenses and small-time violence. Police took the sneakers from Green's basement, but no one was sure if the mud on the soles could be used as evidence.
We had the shoes. How do we find someone who's going to tell us what to do with this? You understand exactly what it is we're trying to do.
Waterford police spent weeks calling around the country, looking for someone who might be able to help. The FBI told them of a scientist at nearby Connecticut College.
Here we are, we're going all over the United States. Connecticut College is 3 minutes or 5 minutes from our police station.
The scientist was Dr. Peter Siver, a forensic limnologist, an expert on microscopic life in freshwater environments. Dr. Siver was asked to find out if the mud on Green's sneakers came from Stenger's Pond. He took the mud from the sneakers and added a mixture of sulfuric acid and potassium dichromate, which removed the dirt, leaving behind only the life forms that may have existed in the water. It's a world invisible to the naked eye.
Inside that small drop of water exists literally hundreds of different organisms. They come in all different arrays, all different shapes, all different colors, and it's an entirely different world underneath that one drop of water.
And what Dr. Siver found were diatoms, microscopic single-cell organisms, a form of algae. Each diatom is housed in an incredibly complex structure made up of silica or glass.
I would say that diatoms are pieces of art. They're pieces of art because each diatom can make exactly the same pattern each time it makes a new cell. And these patterns are very ornate. They're highly artistic in their look.
While diatoms may be art, they can also be pieces of evidence. Any body of water has hundreds, if not thousands, of species of diatoms. The types of diatoms and how many exist of the various species is unique to that body of water.
In any given water body, you can essentially examine the microscopic organisms and, in effect, create a fingerprint for that water body.
On the sneakers, Dr. Siver found large numbers of one type of diatom known as eunotia. Shown here Eunocia are characterized by the crescent shapes of their glass shells. There were 3 species of Eunocia on the suspect's sneakers, and they were there in unusually high concentrations. And Dr. Siver found one more clue. He found what's known as a scaled chrysophyte. Scaled chrysophytes are related to diatoms, but unlike diatoms, they can swim. There was only one species of chrysophyte in the mud, Malamonas caudata, shown here magnified 2,000 times. When Dr. Siver analyzed the water samples from Stenger's Pond, he found the same high concentrations of Eunocia and the same species of scaled chrysophyte. The fingerprint of the water at Stenger's Pond was the same as the sample on the sneakers of Christopher Green. This was the break police had been counting on.
One thing that we found is there's always a scientist out there. As off the wall as it may sound, or what you're trying to accomplish, we have found there's always somebody out there that will listen to you.
Christopher Green, Brian Davis, and Jason were arrested and charged with assault and attempted murder. But the question now turned to motive. Why did they attack the 2 young boys? And was there another intended victim that day? Forensic scientists found a way to prove that one of the suspect's sneakers had been in the water at Stenger's Pond, where the 2 young boys had been assaulted and left for dead.
I think the physical evidence in this case was just overwhelming. And the diatoms and the pond evidence, or the aquatic evidence, whatever way you want to use it, was just devastating. And I think the defense attorneys realized that.
The forensic analysis showed that when Christopher Green went into the water to strike his victims, he got mud on his shoes, mud that contained the microscopic fingerprint of the water in Stenger's Pond. The diatoms in that mud clearly tied him to the crime scene.
For me, I thought it was unique and unusual because it's something that you normally don't read about in textbooks.
Even though Stephen and Bobby's bicycles were stolen after the assault, police and prosecutors do not believe robbery was the motive.
These 3 kids, I am totally convinced, were on a mission that day. As a result of interviewing the 3 after their arrest, they went out to that day to look to kill somebody. There's no doubt in my mind.
Can I help you?
Yeah.
Police believe that Susan Picardi was originally the intended victim. Brian Davis did not have diabetes as he claimed, but only used it as an excuse to gain entry to her home.
Have a seat, and I'll get you some fruit juice.
Thanks.
When he rejoined his accomplices in Susan's backyard, they may have been planning how to get into the house.
The real alarm bells went off when I went upstairs and I saw 2 boys in the corner of my yard, and then I sort of all put it together, and then I started feeling like I was just set up.
Fortunately, Susan Picardi saw them in her bathroom mirror and called the police. She looks back to that day and often wonders how close she was to danger.
A great way to describe it as a sixth sense. The mirror was in the right place, the kids were in the right place. It was meant to be for me to see them and to, just by their body language, understand that something is not right here.
Police determined that Christopher Green, the only one of the defendants with a history of violence, had instigated the attacks.
Christopher Green was probably the ringleader for the other 2. He was the one that brought the bat. He was the one that brought the duct tape. He was the one that did the striking on our victims. He's the one that basically directed the other 2.
Brian Davis and Christopher Green were both tried as adults and were sentenced to a minimum of 18 years in prison. Their 16-year-old accomplice, Jason, was only 2 weeks shy of his 17th birthday when he committed the crime. As a result, he was tried and convicted as a juvenile and was sentenced to spend time in a facility for young offenders. He has since been released. The microscopic diatom evidence on Christopher Green's sneakers, so simple in purpose, so magnificent in design, and so potent as evidence. For Waterford police and for law enforcement around the world, the case set a precedent.
It's a landmark case. It was the first time that this evidence, or evidence of an aquatic environment, meaning the diatoms, were used to place a suspect at a crime scene.
We found that it had never been used before. What was nice about it is they were willing to take it on and try it. And that was the key for us.
Shortly after this case, law enforcement in Switzerland solved the murder of a young boy using diatom evidence. The boy had drowned, and the species of diatoms in the victim's lungs matched the species of diatoms found on the gas pedal of the suspect's automobile. Both cases were solved because a group of Connecticut detectives had a hunch that some mud on the bottom of a shoe might tie a suspect to a crime.
I would never say give up being the old-fashioned, hard beaten-the-road cop, but you've got to be aware of the sciences that are there to help you. If you don't, you're beating yourself.
A lot of the thoughts that Lieutenant McCarthy came up with, we always thought were unusual, but 9 out of 10 times he was right. I have to say 99.8% of the time he was right.
In 1981, police found a partial print near a doorknob at a crime scene. But without a suspect, police had no way to compare the print to the 1 million prints on file. 17 years later, new forensic technology changed that, breathing new life into what was a very old crime. Charles Whittlesey was one of this country's outstanding architects in the early 1900s. He was the first to design poured concrete structures.
He designed and built all the train stations clear across the United States. Albuquerque is one of his most famous, and the next most famous, I would guess, would be El Travar at the rim of the Grand Canyon, which he built in 1902.
Charles had 4 children. But his oldest daughter, Enid, identified with her father's free spirit and creativity more than the others. Enid shunned family pressure to attend college and instead headed to vaudeville. At age 17, she began her career as a Marion Morgan dancer. She was also a singer, performing with the San Francisco Opera. Enid never married, but she loved children. As she grew older, she eventually found work as a governess, but by the 1950s, she retired and moved into a family home on Cimarron Street in Los Angeles. She never owned a car, but was a fixture in the neighborhood, riding on her bicycle, stopping to talk and sometimes play with the neighborhood children.
She would relate to them a lot more so than she would to adults. She had kind of almost a childlike quality about her.
The neighbors all called her the bicycle lady, and everybody spoke highly of her. She was pleasant. She would talk to people.
Even into her 80s, she still rode her bicycle through the neighborhood. But as she grew older, something changed.
She was quite concerned about intruders breaking into her house, to the point where she had built kind of a jerry-rigged alarm system out of wires and threads and cans to alert her if anybody tried to come in a window or a door.
On March 13th, 1981, one of the neighbors noticed Enid's front door was open. Inside the doorway was blood. Paramedics found 86-year-old Enid Whittlesey in her upstairs bedroom, dead from multiple stab wounds. Frank Bolden was the first detective on the scene.
The lady being of a small frame, there's just no way I could believe that she offered much resistance. There was no need for the amount of injuries this woman was subjected to.
The bedroom was ransacked. The motive appeared to be robbery.
Several of the drawers were open. A lot of the items were pulled out. There was blood on various items in and out of drawers.
Bolden also noticed blood drops leading down the left-hand side of the stairs.
The person leaving these blood drops was, in fact, leaving the area of the body, going downstairs and going to the front door. At the front door was a blood smear and print leading to the doorknob of the door.
Investigators hoped that the fingerprints and the blood drops would lead to the killer. The entire neighborhood, including the children, were shocked and saddened by the murder of 86-year-old Enid Whittlesey. Despite her cheerful disposition, her friends knew she was particularly fearful of crime.
Whether it be a premonition, whether just a coincidence, but there was something that did trouble her a lot.
She had always lived a very kind life that had never bothered anybody. This was just not fair that someone so dear and sweet would have to end her days this way. It just was not fair. I mean, to be mutilated like she was.
Inside the home was a wealth of forensic evidence which told the story of what happened during Enid's last moments alive.
We believed that the person had come up on the front porch, opened a window on the front porch, had crawled in the open window, stepped on the dusty piano, had left a footprint. A knife surfaced at some point.
We worked our way upstairs where she was in the bedroom. It's always very sad.
The victim was severely cut and stabbed in different parts of her body.
She had a defensive wound on the outside of her right wrist, which to me showed that when the defendant was trying to stab her, she was putting up her arm in defense and he got her wrist.
And at some point, the suspect was also injured.
It's not uncommon when a knife is used that the attacker slides, because the blood is slippery, they'll slide over the blade and cut themselves.
It appeared the suspect walked back down the stairs, bleeding from his left hand. The forensic evidence revealed that the killer left through the front door and stole Enid's beloved bicycle from the front porch to make his getaway. Michelle Kestler was assigned to collect the blood drops from the home. She started with the grand piano.
Because it was dry and flaky, I used a clean disposable scalpel and just collected it into a clean piece of white paper and made it into a bindle and closed it so it could breathe and put it in a coin envelope.
Kestler used a different technique on the bloodstains on the front door.
Well, in those days, we used cloth squares to dampen with water and disposable tweezers, or clean the tweezers in between with alcohol.
Fingerprint specialists lifted 3 partial prints from a window. A 4th print was discovered on an archway leading to the front door.
They thought it might be a partial of a palm print.
Investigators photographed the footprints using oblique lighting.
It's when you take a flashlight and you shine it on an angle, on an oblique angle. It's kind of like at home when you can't see handprints on your furniture, but you turn on the light and you're looking sideways and there's the fingerprints.
The forensic evidence told police how the crime was committed, but the evidence couldn't identify the killer. This was 1981, 5 years before DNA was first used in a criminal case. Police could find no witnesses to the crime. None of the neighbors had seen anything suspicious. Detectives then looked to other areas for leads.
I was conversing with other detectives, and we were comparing notes. We were comparing prints. But as far as a specific suspect, we had none.
Comparing the fingerprints in Enid Whittlesey's home to others arrested for similar crimes in the area wasn't difficult. But comparing them to everyone in the file was impossible.
You would have to search just over 1 million cards. If there was a known suspect, we can easily pull the card and then do the comparison. But without a known suspect, it would be very difficult, without a full pattern type.
And without a fingerprint match, the case remained unsolved. All investigators knew was that the killer had type B blood and was left-handed. It would take another 16 years before a new technology gave police their first solid lead.
All homicide cops would like to solve their crimes, kind of take it personal, you know, and they usually have put a lot of time and effort into it.
Enid Whittlesey's murder case was one of several unsolved cases that languished in Frank Boland's cold case file.
I remember him telling me that during his 30-year career, there was a handful of cases, maybe 3 cases that haunted him, that he wanted to solve before he retired, and this was one of them.
He had the killer's blood from the crime scene and some of his fingerprints, but little else. But in the years since Enid's murder in 1981, there had been more technological advances in forensic science than at any other time in history. In this age of personal computers, it's hard to remember that in the 1980s, very few people had even seen a computer, let alone used one. Large, expensive mainframe computers were the standard. With an eye to the future, the FBI and the Lockheed Martin Company experimented with using computers to analyze and compare fingerprints. When scanners were developed to capture the prints and the files could be compressed and formatted, the AFIS was born.
AFIS is actually an acronym for Automated Fingerprint Identification System, and it's a computer system. And what it does, it photographs a latent print, it scans it, and then it'll give us a candidate list, usually of 10 people who have similar characteristics to the one that we entered into the system.
This new technology revolutionized fingerprint analysis, not only for new cases, but for old ones.
I would occasionally revisit a lot of my old cases and ask for a recheck of the prints.
So Detective Boland sent the 4 prints found in Enid Whittlesey's home back to the forensics lab. AFIS found no match for the 3 prints taken from the window, but the AFIS had better luck with the partial palm print.
The partial print was such a small area that you weren't sure if it was actually from a fingerprint or if it was from a palm area of the hand.
In this case, the AFIS determined that the print was a partial fingerprint and not a palm print. And the computer identified 10 individuals whose prints needed to be examined further.
We're then able to pull the cards of those candidates and do a comparison. And we do a side-by-side comparison using a special magnifying glass.
The latent print examination identified the owner of the print, Carl Stewart.
I immediately began a background search and found him to live within a half-mile of the victim. He had a lengthy record within the Wilshire Division, having been arrested several times for theft and things of that nature.
Ironically, Carl Stewart was sitting in a Los Angeles jail following an arrest on domestic abuse charges.
I went and found the spouse that had filed the charges on him. I sat down and I interviewed her. Through her, I had learned that he was a person that didn't really care for elderly people, and that he had been a burglar.
She also told police that Stewart targeted seniors in Beverly Hills, Culver City, and Wilshire near his home. And she said one more thing, that Stewart was left-handed. On December 26, 1996, Detective Boland and 2 others interviewed Carl Stewart.
And this lady was hurt to the point where she died. Okay.
I didn't do that.
Pardon?
I didn't do that.
Did you know of it?
No.
At first, Carl Stewart claimed he knew nothing about the robbery or Enid Whittlesey. Then, he changed his story.
I've seen her in the neighborhood.
As my partner and I would release some information on bits and pieces of evidence, he would rethink his statement and make it work around the evidence that was obtained and how it got there.
When told his fingerprint was near Enid's front door, Stewart said he had once been inside her home briefly, but had nothing to do with her murder. District Attorney Hayden Zaki would make the decision on whether to take this case to trial.
The crime happened on March 11th of 1981 when I was still in high school. And I thought to myself, boy, this is an old case. You know, are we still going to have witnesses available, for instance? Do we preserve all the evidence properly?
All of the evidence had been in the police property room for the 16 years since the murder, but one important piece was not. The coroner's reference sample of Enid's blood was missing. It would take another forensic breakthrough not available in 1981 to solve that problem and bring Carl Stewart to justice. Investigators wanted to make sure that it was Carl Stewart's blood inside Enid Whittlesey's home. To do that, scientists needed a sample of Stewart's blood as well as Enid Whittlesey's. But the swatch of Enid's blood taken at her autopsy was missing from the evidence file.
So what we did in lieu of the coroner's blood swatch, we used Enid Whittlesey's pajama top. That was what we were hoping would serve as her reference blood sample, because it was heavily blood-stained.
Small, dried samples of that pajama top were placed in sterile water.
Water dissolves the stain, and it also causes any cells that are present, for example, white blood cells, which contain DNA, to lyse. They break open, spilling up their contents, including the DNA, out into the water.
The next step was to clean the DNA.
I had to pass through something called a centricon tube. That's basically a filter, and what it does is it accomplishes 2 things. It cleans the DNA, and it also concentrates it into a smaller volume of water.
The DNA is then replicated multiple times into a workable sample through a polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. 6 genetic markers were typed and illuminated by a blue color attached in the PCR process.
I had one stain that actually matched the genetic profile of Enid Whittlesey. But on the remaining items, I believe there were 8 other bloodstains from throughout the residence that matched Carl Stewart's genetic profile.
The evidence finally proved that Carl Stewart left the blood trail inside Enid Whittlesey's home.
Carl Franklin Stewart left his blood at that crime scene. It's his blood. What's the defense going to do?
On May 17, 1999, Hayden Zaki presented the forensic evidence of Enid Whittlesey's murder to a jury. Zaki believes that Carl Stewart first noticed Enid during one of her bicycle rides through the neighborhood. Later, Stewart broke into Enid's home through her front window, leaving his footprint on the dusty piano underneath. The motive was robbery. Upstairs, Enid confronted Stewart. A fight ensued, causing the defensive wounds to Enid's arms and hands. During the encounter, Stewart cut his left hand, which left a trail of blood down the left-hand side of the steps. Stewart left his partial print near the front door as he left the scene. A print originally thought to be a palm print, but later identified as a partial fingerprint by the automated fingerprint identification system.
We knew we got our man. We knew that Carl Franklin Stewart was in that house because he left a fingerprint and he left blood. So that's how we knew we had our man.
It took the jury just 2 hours to find Carl Stewart guilty of first-degree murder.
She certainly didn't deserve to die as she did.
He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole. This was the first homicide investigation assigned to Frank Bolin. Despite taking 17 years, he refused to give up.
He will give 110% to every investigation that he participates in. Sometimes he's a little bit of a pain, but you know, it's all for a good cause, and I enjoy working with him.
I can't say it's a happy thing, but I did take a person off the street that was responsible for a horrendous, vicious crime, and I would say that the world, elderly people, females, whoever in general, is a little bit safer today because this person is behind bars.
So many disappointments, so many cases that have gone unsolved that you couldn't do anything with, and then along comes new technology. I think it is so wonderful to think that after all these years that they would go back when they got better equipment and new technological things and try to solve these unsolved crimes and put these people where they belong. I think it's marvelous.
In 1993, 5 men were ambushed at work as they got out of their car. 1 man was killed, 2 others critically injured. The gunman left behind a few spent shell casings, but little else. Forensic scientists would eventually find a clue in some scraped metal, revealing a history that someone had tried to erase. Miguel Roque met his wife on a beach in their native Cuba. The couple moved to Miami, Florida in 1991, where they had their first child, a daughter.
She was beautiful. She's very beautiful. And then he was worried how to give her the good life to her.
Miguel was willing to work hard to get the good life. In 1993, the talented mechanical engineer landed a job at the aircraft modular plant that made airplane parts. The 160 employees were a tight-knit group, and Miguel quickly became one of the family.
I was very impressed that he was here such a short time from his native country, Cuba, and he knew how to speak English. He was a go-getter. He was a go-getter. He knew what he wanted, and he was going for it.
Miguel and 4 other employees were identified by management as having the potential for advancement. so the company asked the men to attend computer classes at night. The men all went to class together and formed a carpool. October 14, 1993 was a night like any other. After class, the atmosphere was light and friendly.
I guess we were getting real comfortable with the class and we were just joking. Different things about work and just funny stuff.
When the car returned to the company parking lot, the driver, Jorge Sanchez, was the first one out. Doug Zamora was the second. Then someone started shooting. Zamora was hit in the arm. He immediately reached for his own gun. Sanchez crawled under the car for cover. Zamora was hit again and ran towards the factory door. Ray Cruz was also hit. Another shot exploded through the windshield and hit Miguel Roque sitting in the back seat. Musa owned a handgun and frantically tried to load it.
I started shooting out the front and the gun jammed.
Another blast went through the roof and hit Miguel a second time. Inside, employees tried to help Doug Zamora, who was quickly losing blood.
At the same time that I was talking to him, Gerardo Manso came from behind me. I turned around with my gun, aiming at him.
Manso was almost a casualty. Luckily, Musa didn't pull the trigger. Manso was a night shift supervisor who heard the shooting and rushed to help. When police and emergency crews arrived, they first helped Ray Cruz, who was outside and bleeding but still alive. Doug Zamora was unconscious. Miguel Roque was still in the back seat and was pronounced dead at the scene.
My husband was the best man that I know in my whole life, the best man that I know, the best person that I knew, the best father that I saw, the best friend that I had in my whole life. I lose him.
Apparently, the shots were fired from the roof of the factory. There were spent shotgun shells, but no sign of the gun or the gunman. Police searched the area by ground and air, and they even shut down a nearby highway. But the gunman had made a clean getaway. Investigators had two questions. Who would shoot 5 employees, and what was the motive? As police investigated the shooting of the 5 employees outside of the airplane factory, they found evidence that the shooter had been on the factory roof and made his getaway down a ladder in the back. The shells found on the roof told investigators the weapon used was a shotgun. The shells were double-aught buckshot. Each shell contained 9 pellets about the same size as a .32 caliber bullet.
Like being shot 9 times at once, because each pellet enters the body and does a lot of damage. The pellet travels at about 1,000 feet a second coming out of the muzzle. So it's like being shot 9 times at once.
The shooting killed one man, Miguel Roque. Douglas Zamora and Ray Cruz were alive, but in critical condition. 2 others, Jorge Sanchez and George Musa, escaped without injury.
I was angry because these are the people that I worked with. They were my responsibility, and I hurt them, and I was just, I don't know, it was my adrenaline, but I was really angry. I wanted to find the shooter.
Police began their investigation by asking about any recent firings or disgruntled current employees. One of the supervisors working on the night of the shooting reported seeing 2 or 3 men in a white Cadillac cruising the factory grounds. This was particularly troubling since one of the shooting victims, Ray Cruz, had a possible link to organized crime.
Ray Cruz had a family member who was currently in a witness protection program
testifying against major drug traffickers who had assassinated some government witnesses.
Police wondered whether the factory shooting was a message to the Cruz family, warning Ray Cruz's brother not to testify at that trial. As police started to investigate that theory, a woman who lived directly behind the factory called to say she had found a gun in her yard.
Because of the police activity in the area, she didn't come outside. She was fearful that there was something going on, that she should stay inside. The next morning when she came outside to feed her cats, she noticed a shotgun and she called police.
There were no fingerprints on the gun, and the serial number had been filed off, making it virtually impossible to trace.
It's what we call a robbery gun, where it's easily concealable by removing part of the barrel and removing the stock from the weapon, and it's easier to hide on a person.
To see if this was the gun used in the factory shooting, Thomas Quirk conducted a ballistic analysis. Most guns have lands and grooves inside the gun barrel, which leave distinctive marks on the bullets. But the barrel of a shotgun is smooth.
Without having a rifled bore, there are no marks left behind on the pellets. We can't identify the pellets. We can only identify the shot shells themselves.
When a shotgun is fired, the expanding gases force the shell casings back against what is called the breech face of the gun.
That shotgun will leave marks on the primer of the shot shells over and over and over. These marks will be the same. So that's what we call the fingerprint of the weapon.
A microscopic comparison showed that the ballistic fingerprint of the sawed-off shotgun matched the markings on the shells found on the factory roof. Although this was the murder weapon, it wasn't the type used by organized crime.
It's been more up close and personal with handguns, so that they are sure that they hit their target, their intended target. A shotgun is a good close-up weapon, but from a long distance, because of the way the projectiles scatter, you may not necessarily hit your target. It didn't appear to be the type of scenario where you have a person on the roof with a shotgun. Just didn't seem to fit.
The gun and shells were the only physical evidence investigators had. But the gun still had a story to tell for those who knew how to read it. Ballistic tests had identified the gun used to kill Miguel Roque and wound Doug Zamora and Ray Cruz. The question now was who owned the gun. The serial number had been removed.
Every mark, the serial number, the brand, the model, the gauge, everything was ground off the weapon, so we had no idea who the manufacturer was or any of the information, the model or serial number.
The first step was to determine the make and model of the gun. The gun vault at the Miami-Dade Police Crime Lab holds over 2,000 firearms of various makes and calibers. Experienced firearms examiners thought it was probably a Remington Model 870 shotgun, so they compared it to the Remington 870 in their vault.
And sure enough, it turned out to be a 12-gauge Remington pump shotgun. They're fairly popular here. As a matter of fact, our police officers carry them.
The Model 870 is popular everywhere. It's one of the best-selling shotguns ever made. Millions have been sold. The killer knew that tracing such a gun without a serial number would be all but impossible.
But he didn't know what a crime laboratory can do.
By law, all firearms sold in the United States must have a serial number stamped into the metal. The number is recorded at the time of sale, allowing any gun to be traced back to the original owner.
When they stamp a serial number into the weapon, it compresses the metal of the weapon, and it makes the metal underneath the serial numbers harder than the metal around it. And that's key for the serial number restoration.
Quirk smoothed the area of the serial number with a sander to create an even surface. He then applied a strong acid to the steel. The smooth surface ensures that the acid eats the steel evenly, but the area where the metal is compressed, the area directly beneath the serial number that was removed, is denser and resists the acid.
And the next thing you'll see will be white ghost numbers of a serial number raising up through that metal.
With the recovered serial number, Detective McColeman contacted the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. They said the manufacturer had sold the gun to a local sporting goods store.
Subsequently went to that store. We obtained the ATF form that the purchaser filled out.
The name on the form was Geraldo Manso. Manso was a night shift supervisor at the airplane factory and was one of the first employees on the scene on the night of the shooting.
We also brought the form to our questions document section in our forensic lab. The signature on both his work records and the form matched.
Investigators discovered that Manso had been angry because others at work had been promoted ahead of him. One of those promoted was Doug Zamora, a victim in the shooting.
I was the foreman of that department, and he thought that he deserved that position. Unfortunately, he didn't get it. I believe it's because of his lack of not being able to communicate with vendors due to the fact that he didn't speak any English. That's probably why I got the position, not because I knew more than him.
But everyone believed Manso got over the disappointment since he didn't appear to harbor any lingering resentment.
As soon as all this happened, the one person I turned to was Manso and said, Manso, you have to help me now here with, well, everything that's going on. These gentlemen are in the hospital, you have to take over. So during that week, he was the person who was making sure the machines were running.
Geraldo Manso denied he was involved in the shooting. It was Manso's closest friend, Miguel Roque, who was killed in the shooting. And Manso had an alibi, since he was seen in the factory immediately following the shooting. But a background check revealed that Manso had been a suspect in another shooting death. The victim allegedly was having an affair with Manso's wife. Police now wondered whether this was a coincidence or a pattern of revenge and murder. Police now suspected Geraldo Manso in the shooting death of Miguel Roque and injuring Doug Zamora and Ray Cruz. The murder weapon was a sawed-off shotgun found in the yard of a woman who lived next to the factory. After raising the serial number, police discovered it was purchased by Geraldo Manso. And Manso had an interesting background.
We ran Geraldo Manso through that system, and it hit on a previous homicide, a homicide of Mr. Gutierrez, which occurred, I believe, in 1991.
The victim, Luis Gutierrez, had been gunned down while in his car on a deserted stretch of road. Manso was questioned because Gutierrez was allegedly having an affair with Manso's wife. Despite a strong motive, no physical evidence linked Manso to the murder, although Gutierrez had been killed with a shotgun. Police asked Manso to come down to police headquarters for questioning. Manso agreed. After questioning him briefly, detectives asked him to take a polygraph or lie detector test. Manso consented. Manso was asked if he knew who was responsible for the shooting and if he was the man who killed Miguel Roque.
His answer, of course, was no, he didn't know, and no, he didn't kill anybody. There was clear deception indicated on the polygraph to those responses.
Confronted with the polygraph results, Manso broke down and confessed. But he said he missed his intended targets and instead killed his best friend, Miguel Roque.
And he told the detectives in his confession that he was very upset that Mr. Roque died because he was not the intended target. In fact, he was the only friend that Manso had in the business. And he indicated his targets were George Sanchez and George Musa.
I think that he regretted that he didn't kill the right people. Other than that, that's the only remorse that he expressed.
Detectives also questioned Manso about the shooting death of Luis Gutierrez.
He goes, oh yeah, 2 years ago I killed my wife's lover, too, with the same gun.
He fired from inside his vehicle, therefore the casing would remain inside his vehicle. So the only thing on that scene were projectiles from the shotgun, which cannot be traced.
Manso was charged with 2 murders, Luis Gutierrez and his co-worker, Miguel Roque. He was also charged with the attempted murder of the other 4 men in the parking lot. Prosecutors believe that what motivated the shooting was resentment at being passed over for advancement.
Because Manso did not speak English, he wasn't invited to go to the training session. He saw this as a threat to his ability to go forward in his occupation, and so he resented the people that were going.
He especially resented his supervisors, George Musa and Jorge Sanchez, for holding him back. So after hours, he used the machinery at work to cut down the barrel of his shotgun and to grind off the serial number. On the night of the shooting, he snuck up to the roof with the easily concealed weapon and ambushed the men he thought were in his way. Although Manso says that Sanchez and Musa were his intended targets, prosecutors don't believe it, since he used a shotgun instead of a rifle. After the shooting, he threw the gun off the roof into one of the yards near the factory, then hurried down to the factory floor to create his alibi.
There's a ladder that led to the top of the building. He must have scurried down. In the confusion, he was able to run out and appear to be concerned. Now, this would only take a couple of seconds.
When George Musa saw Manso immediately after the shooting, he had no idea that Manso was the gunman.
Yes, I had my gun drawn, and Manso was right there. Had I known it was him, the shooter, I would have shot him. There's no doubt in my mind.
I believe that Mr. Manso is a dangerous man, and he deals with his frustrations through violence.
It seemed to be the only way he can resolve things, is to eliminate obstacles.
Geraldo Manso was found guilty of murder and attempted murder and was sentenced to consecutive life terms in prison. Kenya Roque shares keepsakes and memories of Miguel with her daughter Laura. Laura was just 18 months old when her father died. The father who worked long hours to give her a better life in America, but never got to share it with her.
Sometimes I feel that it's a bad dream that I had. It's not real. I'm not here. It was another life. But the only choice that I have is keep busy. Keep tired, keep busy, study, working, doing many things. Don't let my mind any space to think about that.
Doug Zamora and Ray Cruz survived their injuries. Doug's arm was almost amputated, but doctors were able to save it. The shooting changed the victims. Doug Zamora quit his job at the factory and went into law enforcement. He now works as a corrections officer. George Musa, impressed by the EMTs who responded to the shooting, also quit his job and is training to become a medic. Manso believed that by scratching the serial number from his weapon, he would remove all traces of ownership. But forensic technology proved him wrong.
The more forensics that you've got, of course, the better it's going to be. Forensics really don't lie. It's, and they don't make the kind of mistakes that witnesses make. So it's really pretty exciting.
We link the casings to the gun to the man.
In 1992, there were more than 75 suspicious fires set in Seattle, Washington during a 6-month period of time. All appeared deliberately set. It was the biggest arson case in American history, solved with behavioral profiling, hypnosis, and a piece of art. On the night of August 9, 1992, firefighters outside Seattle, Washington faced a disaster. 3 churches were engulfed in flames at the same time, just a few miles from one another.
When we arrived, the fire was probably at its peak. The flames were shooting above the sanctuary, which was a very large sanctuary. You know, I would guess, it must have been 3 stories high.
The next morning, parishioners of Trinity Lutheran arrived to find their church in ruins. Reverend Rouse made an unusual decision. He would conduct services anyway. The parking lot was turned into a makeshift church, and in the midst of smoking embers, the congregation held their Sunday service.
As I looked in the faces of many of my parishioners, you could see the sorrow, the disbelief. Many were crying, tears of sorrow. My staff were crying and holding each other. They thought, this can't be true.
Arson dogs were brought in to look for traces of flammable liquids, but they found none. And chemical tests of the rubble couldn't find accelerants either.
There was really very little trace evidence for us to recover at the scenes.
There was no vandalism at the fire scenes, so the motive appeared to be thrill-seeking. And all of the fires started the same way, on the ground floor at chest level. Over the next several weeks, there were 8 church fires. 6 were Lutheran churches. Eventually, the arsons moved on to businesses and homes. In one night alone, there were 12 different arson fires. All of the fires were set at night without the use of accelerants.
I watched people burned in the middle of the night out of their homes, losing all their possessions, standing literally in their night clothes with nothing but their life left, with their children sobbing.
We heard stories about people jumping out of windows or being lured out of windows. A lot of stories about just devastating financial impacts.
One victim was inside her home when the fire started.
I was just getting out of the tub when I started to hear strange crashing noises outside my house, like glass breaking. I opened the bathroom and there was the front door, and the wall to the left was entirely in flames. It was up in flames.
She grabbed her roommate and ran frantically to the front of the house.
We opened the front door and the entire front porch is up in flames, so our access to get out was denied. And that was absolutely terrifying. That was when you make those split-second decisions. Am I going to live? I've got to move.
The 2 made it out the back door and were lucky to be alive. From August to January, barely a night would go by without another family getting burned out of their home. With each fire, the arsonist was getting more daring.
He was becoming very emboldened, and he would actually set a fire, literally looking through the window at the family at dinner.
Miraculously, despite extensive damage, no one had been killed. No one until the arsonist made his next move. In the fall of 1992, residents of Seattle and the surrounding area were under siege. a serial arsonist had set over 25 fires, targeting churches, businesses, and homes. All of the fires were set at night in the same way, by someone igniting buildings at chest level without the use of accelerants.
I called our arsonist a guerrilla fighter because he, under generally cover of night, would go out, prowl around, be unseen, hit his target, and be gone basically before his target becomes known to anybody as a fire. He was very, very quick. He was extremely covert.
Residents formed vigilante groups to protect their neighborhoods. Local fire companies mounted all-night patrols, but still, the fires continued. The arsonist appeared to be taunting fire investigators.
He would draw out the fire department. We would have one fire in one part of town, and then he would go, a fire station would be nearby, and he would set another fire on the other side. So he knew where the fire departments were.
A task force was formed to coordinate the investigation. They commissioned a psychological profile of their suspect. By interviewing past arsonists and identifying the traits they all have in common, psychologists gain important information about the type of individual who commits these crimes. The profile described the arsonist as white, in his late teens to early 20s, with an alcohol and/or drug problem. He was intelligent but an underachiever who had probably just experienced some major trauma in his life. He would probably be working as a salesman or delivery person, since he seemed familiar with many sections of the area. The arsonist left no clues, but 2 months into the fire spree, when he started fire number 28, he got careless. Investigators found 2 fingerprints near the window where the blaze was set. The prints were run through a computer and checked against hundreds of thousands of prints on file. There was no match, which meant it was likely the arsonist had no prior criminal record. 2 weeks later, at fire number 42, he made another mistake. Urine was found in the snow near the fire. Forensic scientists carefully gathered the sample for DNA testing. But since the urine was mixed with snow, it was difficult to isolate any cells for analysis.
Forensically, we were told that there were just so few cells in there that were capable of extraction that it was not feasible.
Months went by, and the fires continued. The task force was no closer to identifying a suspect.
There was a concern that there were more occupied dwellings that were being targeted, I mean, a large concern that we were going to start seeing people dying.
Unfortunately, just after midnight on September 22nd, 1992, those fears were realized. A fire broke out at a senior citizen home that housed more than 400 people. 3 women, all residents of the home, died.
I felt personally responsible for their deaths, whether it was true or not. The guilt of that, the misplaced guilt of that, was so severe that shortly afterwards I really lost all will to live.
Now, police were searching not only for an arsonist, but a killer. Eventually, the press coverage generated the first lead in the case. A woman called police to say that a well-dressed man bumped into her near one of the fires.
This individual stood out to her. Fashion, it was his clothing, the mannerisms, some odors that she detected, both alcohol and an aftershave or cologne.
She said the man was intoxicated and had mentioned the fires. She got a glimpse of his license plate number, but didn't write it down. The incident happened weeks earlier, and she had only a vague recollection of what the man looked like. In their desperation, investigators made an unusual decision. They decided to try forensic hypnosis. After 60 suspicious fires had been set in Seattle, Washington, investigators finally had a lead. A woman near one of the fires had seen a suspicious-looking man who had bumped into her. He was intoxicated and talked about the fires. But this had happened weeks before, and she couldn't remember much about him. So investigators decided to try forensic hypnosis.
We're trying to find that specific, unique event in her memory that can kind of trigger the rest of the memories to flood out. So it's a relaxation technique. We go back in time with her to this point in time and have her really kind of like watch a movie for us and tell her what she sees.
This was one of the first times in U.S. history that forensic hypnosis was used in a high-profile case, and it was risky. Once a witness is hypnotized, most state laws prohibit an individual from testifying at a trial. As the witness keyed in on the alcohol she smelled on the man's breath, it unlocked images from the night of the fire, and she began to remember what she saw. She recalled a man, tall, thin, with hair pushed back off his face, well-dressed, wearing an Oxford shirt. He appeared intoxicated. And his car, a sedan possibly blue, was unusually clean. When asked if she could remember the license plate number, she recalled the first letter.
I see the letter K.
She was asked if she could recall anything else. She said she saw a 4 and an M. That was all she could remember.
She was very receptive, a great candidate. Actually, I believe that she probably had a photographic memory. After talking with her after the interview, she has the ability for some recall that most people do not have. And I was probably unique of all the interviews I've done.
There were 500,000 sedan cars in northern Washington that had license plates with the letter K. So investigators believed that the physical description of the suspect provided by their witness was the key piece of information. To put this on paper, they brought in composite artist John Hines. He interviewed the witness, who was once again hypnotized.
She's the only witness I've ever done a composite drawing of who's been under hypnosis. And that was kind of an unusual circumstance.
Hines asked her to divide the man's face into sections and try to recall specific details of his appearance. Composite artists categorize the human face by features. There are, for instance, 9 different eye shapes, 5 different head shapes, and so on. Each feature described by the witness is marked on a fact sheet. An FBI facial identification catalog is also used to jog the memory. It contains thousands of pictures of facial features, all visual cues for the witness.
They're taking a visual image, verbally telling me what that image is, and I'm having to take that verbal description and turn it back into a visual image, and that's difficult.
Using the information from the interview, Hines drew what the witness described. The process is an unusual combination of interviewing skill and drawing talent. Each feature was put on paper, with painstaking attention to every detail the witness remembered. After 2 hours of meticulous work, an image was formed. Perhaps this was the first look at the arsonist. When the drawing was finished, Hines showed it to the witness. She said that it looked just like the neatly dressed man she'd seen. 5 months into the fire spree, the task force released their composite drawing to the press. They also released 2 others as a control to help guard against false leads. The psychological profile was also given to the press. It wasn't long. before the hypnotically enhanced composite drawing paid off.
The day that the composites appeared in the Herald, I just became physically ill.
When the composite drawings and psychological profile of the arsonist were released to the media, this man, George Keller, believed he knew the identity of the arsonist. He immediately went home and looked through his cell phone records and discovered that one of his business phones was used on the dates of the fires from locations near the fires. And his business credit card receipt showed that one of his cards was used to purchase gasoline in areas near the fires on the same dates. George Keller faced a gut-wrenching choice. The person using these company credit cards was his son, Paul, who bore a striking resemblance to the hypnotically enhanced composite drawing.
I said, there is a considerable resemblance between these pictures and my son Paul. Then I went through the profile, and because I was looking for a significant personality trait or something that might disqualify Paul, but as I went through all the items of the profile, I couldn't eliminate any.
Paul Keller was 27 years old and employed in the family advertising business. He was the oldest of 3 children in a deeply religious Lutheran family, which possibly explained why Lutheran churches were targeted. Paul Keller's sales routes took him all across the areas where the fires had been set.
He was certainly emotionally rattled, very upset. But as time went on, we also understood from him and from his wife, that Paul's presence in their family had been unsettling from almost the time Paul was born.
His father told police that Paul had an obsession with fire. He said his son had applied for a firefighting job, but had been rejected, and that he had set a fire when he was 9 years old. He fit other aspects of the profile. He was intelligent, but had done poorly in school, had problems with alcohol, and most striking, had suffered an emotional crisis just before the arson spree began.
He at that time was going through a divorce. He was filing for bankruptcy. His life was falling apart. He was drinking heavily.
And the first 3 numbers of his license plate were exactly what the hypnotized witness remembered. The task force put Paul Keller under surveillance. For 10 days, they followed him, hoping they could catch him in the act.
The task force people were trying to keep Paul under surveillance, which was real challenging. And they would lose him periodically, and everybody would panic.
Eventually, they decided to take him into custody.
Hi. All right, Detective Isaacs from the Everett Police Department. Yes. Hi, Keller. Yes. Paul K. Keller. Yes, it is. Born January 6, 1966. Yes, it is. Mr. Keller, you're under arrest. We have a warrant for your arrest. Excuse me.
When Keller arrived at task force headquarters, his father was waiting for him.
George Keller is a bear of a man, and as he embraced him, he put his mouth very close to his ear, hugged him tightly, and said, "It's over, son. It's all over."
I said, it's all over. And I said, the life as you knew it before this morning is over.
At first, Paul Keller said he was innocent.
Am I going to jail today, or am I going to be released on my own? I've never done anything wrong.
15 minutes into the interview, the task force agents complimented him, saying he was the best arsonist they'd ever seen.
I don't think I'm a mean guy, do you? No. I mean, I don't. You are absolutely best in good health. We respect you for what you've been able to do here, isn't it?
And with that, Keller confessed to setting 75 fires, including the fatal fire at the retirement home. Paul Keller's fingerprints matched the ones found on the window at one of the arson fires. His method of operation was surprisingly simple. He just walked up to each site and started the fire with a cigarette lighter.
Did you commit this arson?
Yes. Just walked the stairs, there was corrugated. You can see where some of it's left.
Yeah.
I'll do the same thing, just that fast. I pulled around and the door was just wide open. And there I was in that state of mind, and I lit a chair and she just went. And that was the only one that I really ever stayed to watch of all.
It went real fast.
Fast.
Very fast.
It also went to multiple alarms very fast.
Very fast.
Man.
Keller also said he was sexually molested by a volunteer fireman when he was 12 years old. Paul Keller was convicted of arson and murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He won't be eligible for parole until he is 113 years old.
Again, a word to the victims. All our life, we will be sorrowful for your pain and your loss. We shall never forget to pray for your healing, restoration, and peace. May God in His help, in His grace, help all of us.
Paul Keller's arson spree was the biggest in U.S. history.
It's very hard to rationally explain why I did that, because there's no rational reason. I was not angry at Trinity. I was not, but I was very empty. And perhaps I thought that others needed to be as empty as I was. But it was not a valid thing to do.
And investigators say he may not have been caught if not for the forensic hypnosis and the composite drawing. In 2002, a letter arrived at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper from a man claiming to be a serial killer. The letter included a map with an X marking the spot where he left one of his victims. But the map told forensic scientists a lot more than just the location of a body. It was their key to finding the killer. Just across the river from St. Louis, Missouri is a town called East St. Louis in Illinois, where prostitutes sell their wares, often to finance their drug addictions. 34-year-old Elisa Greenwade was one of those caught in a hopeless cycle.
It's rough when you see somebody that you care about and you feel helpless.
In April of 2001, Elisa Greenwade's body was discovered in Washington Park, Illinois, where she had been strangled, and there were ligature marks on her wrists and ankles. A tire impression was found near her body, which was photographed for analysis. It was identified as a Bridgestone Potenza tire. Just days later, police find 3 more bodies, all known prostitutes.
The victims were just displayed. They were laid out right in the open, right off the side of roadways.
But on one of the victims, police found some evidence.
There was no drag marks on the body, but there was a large tire impression on Betty James' leg.
This tire impression was from a Goodrich Advantage tire, different than the tire impression found at the earlier crime scene. Over the next 5 months, 3 more bodies were found dumped along the streets of East St. Louis. Rape test kits from 2 of the victims yielded biological samples which were sent for testing. The St. Louis Police Department was convinced that the same individual committed all the murders since the crimes were committed in the same manner.
The victims were positioned. There was obvious a disregard for any type of secrecy, any type of cover-up, anything like that. It was an obvious, these were secondary locations.
6 months after the first murder, the crime stopped.
Time went on and no more bodies appeared. We figured either three things. The subject was in custody, he died, or moved out of the area.
St. Louis police called the FBI for further assistance. Special Agent Melanie Jimenez was assigned to the case.
Trying to compile the information so that I could get a package together to send to our behavioral sciences unit at Quantico. I wanted the profilers there to take a look at it and try to give us a profile of who they thought this person was.
Bob Morton was the behavioral profiler working on this case. He knew immediately that these murders would be difficult to solve.
There's no connection other than a business, if you will, transaction between the customer and the prostitute. And that anonymity gives him that blanket to just go in and come out. Most crime is between the races. So if you have a black victim, most of the time you have a black offender.
For 3 months, the killer wasn't heard from. But inexplicably, the murders started again. Over the next 5 months, 3 more bodies were found dumped along the streets of East St. Louis. Verona Thompson, Yvonne Cruz, and Brenda Beasley. The death toll was now at 10. Bill Smith covered this story for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper. One of his stories profiled Teresa Wilson, one of the victims of the serial killer.
What I think I ended up doing was humanizing this woman who, in a way, had kind of dehumanized her own life by getting involved in prostitution and drug activities.
And it wasn't long before Smith got a piece of fan mail. It was a letter from the killer. Days after Bill Smith's article on slain prostitute Teresa Wilson appeared in the newspaper, he received an anonymous letter.
It had a very unusual return address. I noticed also that the postage stamp in the upper right-hand corner was upside down. I started to read it, and I thought it was a joke. I thought it was somebody basically just yanking my chain.
Dear Bill, nice sob story about Teresa Wilson. Write one about Greenwade. Write a good one, and I'll tell you where many others are. To prove I'm real, here's directions to number 17. Search in a 50-yard radius from the X. Put the story in the Sunday paper like the last.
I think he got aggravated, and I think he wanted to somehow show us that these, in fact, were not human beings that we were dealing with, and that he had some kind of a right to do what he was doing.
The letter referenced 17 murders, although police only knew of 10. The return address included the words, "I Thraldom," a bondage website. Along with the letter was a map of a remote area along Highway 67, which was marked with an X. Smith turned the letter over to the authorities.
There's a lot of taunting in a letter like that. He's very proud of himself. He feels that he's smarter than everybody else because he can send this letter and he can get credit for what he did. That was the first thing that came in my mind, is that, he's looking for attention.
When police searched the area described in the map, they discovered the remains of another victim. Now there was no doubt the letter came from the killer. But who wrote the letter, and where did it come from? The return address said New York, but the postmark revealed the letter was mailed in St. Louis. Both the letter and the map were printed from a computer. The map had been cropped to remove any copyright notices from the map company.
It had to take a lot of time He does not want to expose himself by going to a public library, a Kinko's, or wherever else you can get access to a computer. This is something you're going to do at home that you can print out. Not only that, he printed it on the same kind of paper that the letter was on.
This man is an intelligence agent with the Illinois State Police. Due to the sensitive nature of his job, we cannot reveal his identity. It was his job to perform the tedious process of finding the owner or copyright holder of that map. He compared the map to every CD-ROM and internet site that provides maps and directions. After hours of searching, he found the map used by the killer. It was on an internet service called Expedia.com. Expedia said that Microsoft provided the maps for use on their site. The map was proprietary, meaning that Expedia was the only site which offered that map and no one else. The FBI wanted to know the identity of everyone who had accessed this St. Louis map between the day the newspaper article appeared, May 19th, and the postmark of the letter, which was May 21st.
It gave us a 4 to 5 day window of opportunity to see when that map had been accessed over the internet.
When served with the subpoena, Microsoft analyzed their computer download records and discovered that only one computer had downloaded that map during that 4-day period. And the size of the downloaded map was identical to the map sent to the newspaper. But investigators needed to know the location of the computer. Microsoft couldn't identify the individual by name, only by what is called an IP number. So investigators performed what they call an IP reversal process, the same technique used to find child pornographers. The IP address, which is 4 sets of numbers separated by periods, identifies a particular computer's location on the internet. Computers linked to a network through a fixed connection typically have a permanent IP address, while computers that access the internet with a dial-up service are assigned an IP address for each session. To find the location of this particular IP user, the FBI turned to WorldCom, which provides the dial-up connection from computer to server. WorldCom's investigation revealed that the map was downloaded at 7:36 p.m. Central Time on May 20th from the Expedia site through the MSN online service. The map was downloaded by someone using the screen name Maury Travis.
It did appear to be an individual's actual name. However, I knew that that didn't necessarily mean it was his true identity.
The home was in Ferguson, a quiet middle-class suburb just outside of St. Louis. It was owned by a 55-year-old woman who had no prior criminal record. Investigators suspected the homeowner wasn't a killer, but who had access to her computer? Forensic computer search discovered that the map sent to the local newspaper revealing the location of a murder victim had been downloaded by a computer in this home. Investigators decided to have a look inside.
I knocked. I said, FBI, we have a search warrant. I announced at least 3 times.
Eventually, a man and a woman answered the door.
He was mad. He was in a pair of boxer shorts. The first thing out of his mouth was, "It's 7 o'clock in the morning." And you're right, it's 7 o'clock in the morning. And we're serving a federal search warrant. Okay, why are you here? And our response was, "You know why we're here." He dropped his head. He said, "Yeah, I know why you're here."
Inside, police found a computer, women's wigs and shoes, a stun gun, and a collection of homemade videotapes. The basement was spattered with blood. The ceiling, walls, doors, and carpet, even the furniture. The man identified himself as 36-year-old Maury Travis, a restaurant worker who had served time for a string of armed robberies. His mother owned the home, but didn't live there. The woman was Travis's longtime girlfriend, who told police she had never been in the basement of the house.
She didn't have any idea what was going on in that house, and he didn't want her to know.
Next to the desk was a file cabinet. We broke into that cabinet and found a knapsack in there. And the knapsack was, we referred to it as a working bag. In there was duct tape, ligatures, straps to tie victims up, a hose-type stocking that he used as gloves.
Forensic scientists gathered samples of the blood in the basement for analysis. It was a mixture from 6 different individuals.
No one ever seen any activity or anything around that house, and so it's just pretty scary. You think your neighborhood is really safe, and you don't know who your next door neighbor is.
Investigators found several drafts of the letter sent to the newspaper on his computer's hard drive. They also found 2 cars at the house. On one of the cars was a Goodrich Advantage tire that matched the tire impression left on Betty James' leg. A tire on the other car was a Bridgestone Potenza, which matched the tire impression near Elisa Greenwade's body. Travis was taken to St. Louis Police Department headquarters.
He did not talk about the crimes, and actually we didn't ask him about any of the crimes. Our concern was attempting to get him to cooperate with us to take us to more victims. He claimed in his letter that there were 17 victims. Our concern, of course, was to find the rest of the victims.
I have never interviewed anybody like that. His entire world circled around him. He was in control. He wanted to be the focus of everything and had no remorse, no nothing. He was, the only way you can say it, he is a monster. He is just pure evil.
During questioning, he asked for a soda.
Later on, when we went to another interview room, I had the soda can taken to the lab.
Mary Beth Carr swabbed the area near the opening for epithelial cells in Travis's saliva, which could be used for DNA testing. When Travis's DNA profile was compared to the biological material found on 2 of the murder victims, Yvonne Cruz and Brenda Beasley, Travis's DNA matched. Eventually, Travis asked police how they found him.
We told him, well, there was a computer inquiry made over the internet, and he cussed a couple times and had some nice words to say about the internet, and then he cussed again about his computer. And he was very, very upset. I don't think he realized what he had done once he did that. And it dawned on him. It hit him like a ton of bricks.
During questioning, Travis refused to reveal the locations of any of his other victims. Before police could question him again, there was another murder, which would end the investigation forever. On June 7, 2002, Maury Troy Travis was charged with kidnapping and murder. The homemade videotapes discovered in Travis's home showed Travis socializing with various women. But one videotape contained horrendous images, the likes of which police had never seen before.
There's even an actual murder. I mean, you witness him actually killing one of these people.
What was going on inside his head, why he did what he did. That's how I look at it, trying to figure out what makes a person do this.
Investigators also found plans in Travis's home to expand his basement dungeon.
He was planning on building a 2-cell holding tank in his basement. He had ordered more handcuffs and leg shackles through the internet. He was even getting bids on expanding his basement to put the secret dungeon in. Only God knows how far this would have gone.
Based on on the computer's forensic evidence, investigators believe that Travis enjoyed reading the articles about his crimes in the newspaper.
Police will say that these men live vicariously through the media sometimes after their crimes are committed. So they can take the newspaper article, or they can take the TV show or whatever it might be, and they can relive their crime and get a kind of a high from that also.
And on the night of May 20th, Travis typed his letter to journalist Bill Smith. At 7:36 p.m., he visited the Expedia.com site looking for a map he could use to show authorities where they could find one of his victims. After downloading the map, he carefully cropped the copyright notices from around the map, thinking this would eliminate the possibility of tracing it. But he was wrong. The map was as good as a fingerprint, in this case, a computer fingerprint. Maury Travis was taken to prison to await trial. He was placed under a 24-hour suicide watch where guards check on him every 15 minutes.
He didn't want to go back to the penitentiary. He made that very clear to us. I'm not going back to the penitentiary, and you're not going to give me the needle.
For whatever reason, guards skipped 2 back-to-back checks. It was all the time Travis needed to hang himself in his cell, without ever admitting guilt or leading police to the bodies of his other victims.
This is where he was found hanging.
They had let him literally slip right through their fingers. To say that I was angry, and to say that people in the newsroom were angry about it and that the community was angry about it is really an understatement. I think people were furious. And the families of those women should have been furious. That absolutely no way should have ever been allowed to happen.
When Mr. Travis hung himself, he took all the answers with him. We have a million questions.
I think it's amazing that it's such an incredible tool that through analyzing the computer, we were able to catch someone that was committing crimes like this.
Had anybody said, hey, the guy's going to send you a map, and for the investigators to be able to backtrack to him, never thought that in my wildest dreams. It's almost like him saying, okay, here's a map, and this is how you find me. X marks the spot. How many times does that really happen? It doesn't.
This young couple had everything. Successful careers, money, time to enjoy it, and a home fit for a movie star. Then, everything changed. Their 3-year-old son developed serious respiratory problems, and his father started showing signs of Alzheimer's disease. Forensic scientists needed to know whether these illnesses were bad luck, bad genes, or something else. Dripping Springs, Texas, a town where you can enjoy the beauty of the Texas Hill Country, yet commute to downtown Austin in just over half an hour. Melinda Ballard fell in love with Dripping Springs and bought this Georgian-style mansion on 72 acres of land. In 1994, she met Ron Allison. After dating for less than a year, the couple married.
Well, he's everything I had ever wanted in a man. Very intelligent, a real go-getter, a workaholic, which is what I am, so we seem to match up pretty well in that regard. Just a super guy.
We both had the same interest. We both wanted to have a family. I think that was the
key, career-wise, but similar interests.
Melinda had been head of her own public relations business, a firm she sold in 1989, but she still continued her career.
I sit as a board member of a bank and still represent a number of clients that are, I guess, holdovers from my company in New York.
Ron worked in investment banking and was head of corporate finance at his firm. In 1996, Melinda gave birth to their son, Reese. Ron loved being a father and a weekend baseball coach. Then, in February 1999, 3-year-old Reese developed what seemed like a flu.
He started having some respiratory problems, and he would have a real hard time catching his breath. And we thought, golly, maybe he's exercising too much or something.
The symptoms lingered. 1 month later, Reese seemed to be getting worse, not better.
Initially, we thought maybe it's because Reese is in preschool, in nursery school, and you know how kids they constantly contaminate one another with a little bug or virus.
Doctors could find nothing wrong. Tests were inconclusive. When he was taken for allergy tests, those too were negative. Soon, Reese's problems moved from respiratory to neurological. Reese, who had learned his ABCs from A to Z, suddenly couldn't get past D.
He was deteriorating quickly, and we were taking him to doctor after doctor after doctor, and they told us that something was wrong, but they didn't know what it was.
When doctors came up empty, a team of forensic scientists and epidemiologists had better luck. Melinda Ballard was living a dream life. She and her husband had a beautiful home, a healthy, adorable son, and successful careers, until their 3-year-old son developed a serious illness.
I didn't know if he had some kind of rare disease that nobody had ever heard of. I didn't know what to think, but I knew it was getting worse, and that we were not able at the time to get a handle on the situation.
Reese was still asthmatic, very asthmatic. In fact, the pulmonologist said he had scarred lung tissue.
But still, the cause couldn't be found. It appeared to Ron's co-workers that the stress associated with his son's illness was starting to get to him.
Ron was sitting at his desk, and Ron was looking at his computer screen, which wasn't unusual. But when I walked closer to his desk, I realized that he was staring at a blank screen.
And Ron exhibited other symptoms.
He came out of the grocery store and could not remember where he had parked his car or what car he even drove. It took him about 5 hours to come back from the grocery store when it should have taken him 20 minutes. And when he gets home, everything's melted, and he said, I don't know, I had a blackout or something.
I didn't know what was going on, and the wheels were coming off, and I was scared.
Ron went to a neurologist for testing. The results showed a dramatic decrease in his cognitive abilities.
My doctor sat me down and told me that I was about halfway through the progression of Alzheimer's. And that's based on my neurological test results. But that's all he could tell me is that you're functioning on this level, and it seems to be getting worse, but they didn't know exactly why or what to do about it.
On April 1st, 1999, Melinda boarded a Southwest Airlines flight heading to Little Rock, Arkansas. It was a flight that forever changed the course of her life. A man named Bill Holder was assigned to the seat next to Melinda.
On the way to Dallas, which was our first stop, I heard her talking to some people that are sitting there by me, and she was complaining about all these illnesses and problems that she and her family were having.
And without warning, Melinda fell ill.
And I kept coughing up blood. And Bill Holder said to me, "Lady, what in the world's wrong with you?" And I said, "I really don't know."
I just asked her, I said, "Do you have a water leak at your house?" And she said, "Yes, I do. I have several water leaks."
She told Holder that a month earlier there was a leak in her home, causing the downstairs floors to buckle. A plumber repaired the leak, which was in the water line leading to the refrigerator's ice maker. Holder began to suspect that it was a mold causing the family's illness. Holder owns the Assured Indoor Air Quality business that removes toxic mold from buildings. But Melinda dismissed this possibility. She kept her home spotless, and no one in her family tested positive for allergies.
The allergist did these little pinprick tests to determine whether or not we were allergic to mold. And it came back that we weren't. So I dismissed it as our problem.
But during their conversation on the plane, Holder said something prophetic.
He's telling me, "These aren't allergens, lady. This is a poison."
Now suspecting that there was some kind of mold behind a wall or above the ceiling somewhere, Ron and Melinda decided not to take any chances and moved out of the main house into an apartment over the garage. But even with the move, Ron's neurological problems continued to get worse.
At the office, I would be on a phone call and 10 or 20 minutes into the phone call, just not have any idea what we'd discussed.
If there was some kind of mold behind a wall or ceiling, how would investigators find it? Medical experts began to suspect that something in their home environment was making Ron, Melinda, and Reese sick. The property included 72 acres. There was a man-made pond that Melinda stocked with swans and catfish, a barn for horses, a backyard gazebo and pool. The house itself was enormous, 12,000 square feet, modeled after the movie version of Tara, Scarlett O'Hara's plantation home in Gone with the Wind.
It was lots of columns, a Georgian-style home, antebellum, and it was just gorgeous.
Scientific experts began to focus on the possibility that it was mold.
For mold to grow, it requires water to be where it shouldn't be. It requires cellulose, which is a component of most building materials, for example, sheetrock, ceiling tile, pressed particle board. And then a mold also needs the appropriate temperature and it needs oxygen.
Melinda asked Bill Holder to inspect their home to see if he could find anything suspicious. He started behind the refrigerator, the location of the original water leak, and under the first floor floorboards.
Take clear cellophane tape, push it on the suspect area, and then attach it to a glass slide. Then at the same time, take a sterile cotton swab and lift some of the material off of that surface with a sterile cotton swab, put it in a sterile container, send it to the laboratory.
Dr. David Strauss is a professor of microbiology and immunology at Texas Tech University.
I spent about a half an hour in the house, and I was talking with Bill, Mr. Holder, and I said to him, turned to him, and I said, "Bill, I don't feel very good." I said, "I got to get out of here," and really just literally walked out the front door and pretty much collapsed. I lost any ability to stand without aid.
The samples were processed at Texas Tech Health Sciences Center. Technicians there sterilized the slides, then examined them under a high-powered microscope. The cotton swab samples were transferred to Petri dishes, then put in an incubator for 5 to 7 days. If there were spores present, they would grow mold, which could be examined under the microscope. Most household molds are harmless, but Dr. Strauss found one type of mold in the home that was not harmless. It was a toxic, deadly mold known as Stachybotrys. Experts believe Stachybotrys spores exist on many building materials. As long as those materials stay dry, the spores don't present a problem. But when the spores get wet from a leaky roof, for example, or in a dark, moist environment, and are near a paper product like drywall and insulation, the spores multiply quickly, and they produce a potentially deadly poison called mycotoxins.
Mycotoxins are on the surface of these spores. So when you inhale these fungal spores, you're also taking the mycotoxins into your lungs as well.
Later, Bill Holder went back to conduct an airborne test. Canisters placed throughout the house capture any airborne spores which might be present. A short time later, Melinda was notified of the results.
They informed us that it was literally everywhere, and including in the apartment where we were living, and for us it'd be a good idea to leave.
To avoid the possibility of cross-contamination, the family was told to leave the grounds immediately and to take nothing with them.
At that point, we got the heck out of Dodge. We left with literally nothing from that home because of cross-contamination. We didn't want to bring a problem with us.
Buildings never get better by themselves. In fact, if you leave a building alone that has mold infestation, it gets worse.
Melinda and Ron hoped the family's health problems would clear up once they left the house. But they didn't.
Ron is a bright guy. But he's become almost, it's very sad. He carries a little notebook in his pocket. Got his phone number, his car license number, things of this nature. And he's not a buffoon by any stretch, you know, but I know he's seriously affected by this.
Ron just really loves his son. And on several occasions, I would hear him talking about his son, and he would say, "My son," and stop because he didn't remember his son's name.
Ron's memory problems forced him to resign from his firm. Reese continued to suffer from asthma and learning disabilities. Only Melinda came through without permanent health problems. Doctors have no idea why. Toxic mold reproduces by shedding microscopic spores. It can't be cleaned from surfaces because to do so would release thousands of spores into the air. Instead, each piece of contaminated building material has to be dismantled, sealed in airtight plastic, and carted away. The question now was, could the house be saved? Melinda and Ron moved out of their dream home following the scientific diagnosis that it was infested with a potentially deadly mold growing behind the walls and ceilings. The couple says that the first time they noticed any water damage was the leak behind the refrigerator, which the plumber had fixed. The leak had caused extensive damage to the flooring throughout the area. The couple says they wanted to repair the water damage right away. But their insurance company said no.
We had asked the insurance company in writing to allow us to begin repairs immediately and at least rip out some of the wet flooring. And the insurance company said that if I had made repairs during their investigation, that I would lose coverage.
Scientific experts say that most household molds are harmless. But with Stachybotrys, the mold must be removed immediately since it's capable of spreading. The cost to eliminate all of the Stachybotrys in Ron and Melinda's home was originally estimated to be $1 million. The insurance company offered less than $200,000. While the two sides tried to reach a settlement, construction experts found 13 additional plumbing leaks and 1 roof leak in the home, causing even more Stachybotrys contamination.
They kept wanting to investigate claims, which is their right and their duty to do. But the problem is, they would never allow us to begin making repairs.
The investigations and disputes over cost dragged on for 2 years. By then, experts concluded that the house and everything in it was so contaminated, it was beyond repair. To enter the house now, Melinda has to don a special suit and respirator to protect herself against the poisonous mold. Experts recommended that the home be demolished. Melinda and Ron filed suit against their insurance company for the financial loss of their property.
The last thing I wanted to do was have to sue my insurance company, but they left me no choice.
The suit argued that the insurance company knew or should have known about the potentially dangerous effects of delaying repairs to water damage inside of homes and buildings. Dr. Michael Gray sees more than 150 patients a year who suffer from exposure to toxic molds.
I concluded that Ron Allison was definitely affected by the mycotoxins which he was exposed to in the context of his living environment in the house that they lived in.
In addition to medical experts, Ron's attorney presented epidemiological studies showing the relationship between trichothezene, the toxin found in Stachybotrys mold, and mental functioning.
I was confident that we had found the kind of scientific information that would allow us to try this case to a jury, yes.
Ron and Melinda were asking the insurance company for the cost of their home and property, $6 million. The jury took 2.5 days to come back with their verdict, but it was not for the $6 million Melinda and Ron asked for. The jury awarded the couple $32 million.
It was a great relief to me that the jury system worked.
I was obviously relieved. I had hoped that they would not get away with what they had done.
The verdict in this case is now on appeal. The home, once a showplace, is now sitting abandoned. It's been looted numerous times. Ron is learning to live with an impaired memory. He enters his daily schedule into his handheld computer each morning and relies on its alarm to help him stay on track. To make certain that people know their rights relative to water damage in their home, Melinda created her own website, policyholdersofamerica.org.
It's not just been a home that has been lost here. It has been the health of a little boy and a very energetic workaholic man who has lost his identity. And I don't want to see this happen to any other family, I can promise you that. All of those medical doctors and quality scientists that have been involved in our case are my heroes. They are our heroes.